The moon hangs low over the endless prairies of the American West. Its pale light casts shadows dancing like ghosts over the 100-acre farm Caleb Holt had just bought for $1. Night fell quickly, and the lightning deal struck in the afternoon heat was now a distant memory. A lonely wind howls through the rotting boards of the old fence, whispering secrets that no one can decipher. The old house stood tall in the middle of the land, its jagged silhouette clearly visible against the starless sky, a forgotten relic of long-buried dreams. Caleb stepped onto the creaking porch, his lantern casting a weak flickering light on the warped boards. The cold brass doorknob bit into his palm as he pushed it open, the hinges squeaking as a warning. Inside, darkness swallowed the light heavy with the musty smell of neglect. The living room was a graveyard of forgotten things, a tattered armchair, a cold fireplace, tattered curtains that fluttered as if touched by invisible hands. His boots stirred up, a swirl of dust in the dim light, and his heart pounded loud enough to drown out the sounds of the night. Then a sound, a soft thud from upstairs like a book falling onto the wooden floor. Caleb stood frozen, the lantern shaking in his hand, its light drawing distorted shadows on the wall. Then came the second sound, not a thud, but a soft, slow, deliberate footstep. Someone is up there, moving carefully like a thief in his own house. His breath caught as a dark shadow swept across the top of the stairs, quickly and silently disappearing into the black recesses of the hallway. But it wasn't just any shadow. It had curves, bare feet, and long, smoky hair. The house should have been empty. Amos Boone swore it was, but someone was here lurking in the shadows watching. Caleb's hand tightened on the lantern, sweat forming on his forehead despite the cold. He came to the west to find peace, to start over. But now, standing in this ruined shell of a haunted house, the lantern shaking in his hand, he felt the weight of something older than regret, something waiting to be answered. Did he buy a dream or walk straight into a trap? In that split second, Caleb knew one thing for sure: he was not alone. Not in the house, not in his thoughts, not tonight. Dawn poured gold over the vast meadows, but its warmth could not dispel the cold in Caleb's bones. Clara's story kept him awake all night. Her words by the cold fire woven a tale too heavy for a lonely soul. Her father's gold mine robbed by the Maddox brothers using forged documents. His death in a mine collapse. Not an accident, but a murder. Clara ran away with the contract and the real survey map. Evidence that could destroy the Maddox family. For 3 years, she had been hiding here, keeping this farm alive while they hunted her. Caleb listened, his own ghost stirring. His wife's face was feverish, her hands slipping from his in the dark. He failed to protect her once. The weight of that loss was even heavier now, standing so close to Clara's pain. They worked side by side that day, repairing the broken fence under the scorching sun. Clara moved with fierce purpose, her arms strong as she hammered nails into the wood. Her shirt stuck to her sweaty back. A bead of sweat glistened on the curve of her spine, and Caleb's eyes stopped. His throat tightened with a longing he hadn't felt in years. He turned away, gripping the hammer until his knuckles turned white, shamed of the urge rising within him. She was a storm, beautiful and dangerous, and he was a man sworn to live alone. "You don't have to stay," Clara said, wiping her forehead, her sleeve slipping down to reveal the soft line of her collarbone. "This war is not yours." Her voice was even, but her eyes held doubt, as if she expected him to turn and run. Caleb met her gaze, her face flushed from the sun, both fierce and fragile. "This is my land now," he said, "and I don't run away." She nodded, a silent oath passed between them, binding them tighter than words could hold. That night, the air in the house became thick, filled with something unspeakable. Clara sat by the fire, mending a tear in her sleeve. Her fingers were deft, the fire casting shadows that softened the harsh lines of sadness onto her face. Caleb watched the firelight, drawing the curve of her cheek, the rise and fall of her breasts under her thin shirt. He reached out for a piece of firewood. His hand touched hers, and the touch was like a spark, sharp and hot. Her breath caught slightly, her eyes looking up at him, wide and defenseless, pulling him into a current he couldn't resist. The room shrank, the crackling fire drowning out all the sounds of the world. Clara, he whispered, his voice hoarse, his fingers brushing her wrist, feeling the pulse racing beneath her skin. She didn't pull back. Her lips parted, and he caught a whiff of sage on her breath. A wild sweetness draws him closer. He leaned down, his hand sliding to her neck, his thumb brushing the soft skin below her ear. She shivered, a low moan escaping her throat, and her hand came to rest on his chest. Not to push him away, but to hold him there, as if testing the weight of his heart. Their faces were inches apart, the heat between them, a living entity threatening to burn down the walls they had both built. His lips brushed hers, the promise of a kiss like a fire in his blood, a chance to feel alive again after years of being buried in pain. A sharp, panicked neigh tore through the night, the cry of a horse from the distant plains. Clara flinched, her hands falling to her sides as fear filled her eyes, extinguishing the warmth of the moment. She rushed to the window, looking through the torn curtains, her breath coming in gasps. "They're here," she whispered, her voice choked with fear. Caleb's heart pounded as he reached for the knife, the warmth of her touch replaced by cold reality. 3 dark figures moved on the horizon, the riders on the trail. The sound of their horses' hooves sounded like a low roar. Clara clung to his arm, her fingers tightening. "Wade Tucker," she said, calling out to the demon standing at their door. "He was with the Maddoxes. They found me." The riders drew closer, their silhouettes clear on the moonlit plain, and Caleb knew that the fight he had tried to avoid had come to claim them both. The night air was sharp, cutting through Caleb's shirt as he stood on the porch, Clara close behind him. Wade Tucker and his men were arrayed across the yard, their shadows long and sharp across the moonlit plain, blocking any escape from the farm. Clara's hand touched his back, a fleeting touch that steadied him, though her fear was a burden he could feel. "You don't have to do this," she whispered, her voice trembling, but strong. "Go away, Caleb." He shook his head, his eyes locked on Wade, whose spurs clicked with each step as he slowly approached. "This is my land." Caleb called, his voice steady despite the sweat on his palms. "And you are not welcome." Wade's laugh was cold as gravel against steel. "There's a hero here, boys." He placed his hand on the gun, calm but ready, the moonlight glinting off the barrel. "We just want the girl and what she stole. Get out of the way, or you will bleed on your own soil." Clara stepped forward, her chin held high, but Caleb blocked her path, his heart pounding. "She's not going anywhere," he said, the knife heavy at his belt. Useless against guns, but it was all he had. Clara's fingers slid up his arm, and he caught a glimpse of her body's curves in the dim light. Her strength and vulnerability stirred something deep within him. She is a war he did not choose but could not leave. "The papers are on the floor near to the fireplace," Clara whispered, her voice breaking. "If they get it, it's all over." Caleb's stomach clenched. Those papers were her father's legacy, her last defense against the Maddoxes. "You can't let them win." Wade took another step, his eyes narrowing. "Last chance, buddy. Hand her over, or we will take what we came for." Caleb's hands clenched, his mind reeling. 5 years of saving for this land, only to face death on the very first night. The sound of horses' hooves pounded from the east, fast and strong, dust flying up like a storm. Wade turned around, his gun half drawn. As the 5 horsemen crossed the hilltop, Caleb squinted, catching a glimpse of the glint of the badge on the lead knight's vest. "Sheriff Ezra Bennett," Clara gasped, hope flashing in her voice. But Wade's gun was pointed at Caleb, the cold barrel pressed against his forehead. "Don't move," Wade growled, his voice choked with panic. "This isn't over." Ezra's voice echoed throughout the yard. "Wade Tucker, put the gun down. I have a warrant for your arrest." "Murder, robbery, conspiracy." Wade's eyes widened, but the barrel of the gun didn't move. "You have no proof," he snarled. Ezra dismounted, his lieutenants lined up their rifles steady. "I have a witness. Silas Harden saw you orchestrate the mine collapse that killed Thomas Wade. He said you and the Maddoxes planned it." Clara gasped, her hand covering her mouth, tears welling up. "Someone saw," she whispered, her voice hoarse. Caleb felt the gun tremble against his skin, Wade's desperation rising like a cornered animal. Wade growled, but his voice cracked. One of his men, Johnny, backed away, his hands raised. I'm not hanging for you, Wade. The remaining man spurred his horse and ran, the sound of his hooves fading into the night. Wade stood alone now, gun still pointed at Caleb, his eyes wild. You think this is the end, he hissed. The Maddoxes will hunt her to death. Caleb looked him straight in the eye, his heart pounding. Not while I'm here. Clara's hand found his, her fingers entwined, her touch a lifeline in the chaos. Her eyes, both fierce and fragile, looked into his, and he felt her trust, heavy as an oath. Wade's finger tightened on the trigger, his breath coming in gasps. Caleb was about to dive when a gunshot rang out, not from Wade but from Ezra's aide. Wade staggered, blood spreading across his chest, and he fell to the ground, the gun spinning uselessly. The night was silent, the only sound was Clara's panting beside him. Ezra approached, his face stern but kind. Ms. Wade, we're going to need those papers. It's time for things to be settled. Clara nodded, her hand still in Caleb's, her touch holding him. When the assistants processed the scene, Caleb looked at her, her face illuminated by the fading moonlight, and he knew the fight wasn't over yet. The Maddoxes were still out there, and the weight of Clara's hand in his was a promise he might not be able to keep. The dust settled slowly, stirred up by the hooves of Ezra's men as they dragged Wade Tucker's body away. The moon hung low, its cold light on the now quiet farmhouse, except for the soft creak of the porch under Caleb's boots. Clara stood beside him, her hand no longer in his, but close enough to feel her warmth. She gave Ezra those papers, her father's contract maps, marking a treasure trove and a bloody path. I'm ready, she told the sheriff, her voice even but her eyes wet. I will testify for my father. Ezra nodded, promising to return in a week to take her to the territorial court. The Maddoxes will face justice, but the price is heavy. Clara's years on the run, Caleb's dreams of a simple life, both scarred by a war none of them sought. Caleb looked out over the meadows, the horizon painted orange and purple by the setting sun. He bought this land for $1, pursuing a future without ghosts. But Clara, with her fierce heart and haunting eyes, changed that. She offered to leave so he could have the farm alone. You don't need my trouble, she said, but her voice dropped, revealing her fear of being abandoned again. Caleb shook his head. This place is big enough for two. He said the words like a vow he hadn't planned. Clara's lips curved up, a small smile piercing her sadness, and in that moment, he saw a glimmer of hope, fragile but alive. They stood there shoulder to shoulder as the first stars pierced the sky. The farm was theirs now, a battlefield turned home, its old fences reaching toward a new dawn. Caleb felt the burden of his past lifted. Not gone, but lighter, shared with someone who understood loss. Clara reached out for his hand, her fingers calloused but warm, and he didn't pull away. Together they walked toward the open door, ready to build something that could last forever. The dust settled slowly, stirred up by the hooves of Ezra's men as they dragged Wade Tucker's body away. The moon hung low, its cold light on the now quiet farmhouse, except for the soft creak of the porch under Caleb's boots. Clara stood beside him, her hand no longer in his, but close enough to feel her warmth. She gave Ezra those papers, her father's contract maps marking a treasure trove and a bloody path. I'm ready, she told the sheriff, her voice even, but her eyes wet. I will testify for my father. Ezra nodded, promising to return in a week to take her to the territorial court. The Maddoxes will face justice, but the price is heavy. Clara's years on the run, Caleb's dreams of a simple life, both scarred by a war none of them sought. Caleb looked out over the meadows, the horizon painted orange and purple by the setting sun. He bought this land for $1, pursuing a future without ghosts. But Clara, with her fierce heart and haunting eyes, changed that. She offered to leave so he could have the farm alone. You don't need my trouble, she said, but her voice dropped, revealing her fear of being abandoned again. Caleb shook his head. This place is big enough for two. He said the words sounding like a vow he hadn't planned. Clara's lips curved up, a small smile piercing her sadness, and in that moment he saw a glimmer of hope, fragile but alive. They stood there shoulder to shoulder as the first stars pierced the sky. The farm was theirs now, a battlefield turned home, its old fences reaching toward a new dawn. Caleb felt the burden of his past lifted, not gone, but lighter, shared with someone who understood loss. Clara reached out for his hand, her fingers calloused but warm, and he didn't pull away. Together they walked toward the open door, ready to build something that could last forever. 1 week later, the western sun was still burning, but this time it brought a new hope, not its usual harshness. Ezra Bennett returned not with the haste of a pursuit, but with the sternness of justice. He did not come alone. With him came a group of other sheriffs, and among them Caleb recognized Silas Hardin, the brave witness who had stood up against the Maddoxes. Clara, wearing the only dress she had left, stood on the porch, her dark hair tied back in a bun, her face strangely radiant. No longer the girl who had shivered in the darkness that night. Her eyes held a steely determination now, a fire that had been tempered by trial. She held Caleb's hand tightly, the warmth of her hand giving him strength, a quiet comfort that he was not alone. "We are prepared, Miss Wade." Ezra said, his voice warm but authoritative. "The road to Silver City will be long, but justice awaits." Clara nodded, a thrill rising in her heart. She looked at Caleb, and there was an unspoken goodbye in her eyes, a promise to return, or maybe an invitation to come along. Caleb squeezed her hand, but he knew he couldn't leave. This farm, this land, was where he found peace, where he started over. He had to stay to protect what he had found. He believed that this would be where she would find safety when she returned. As Clara, Ezra, and the assistants disappeared over the hills, a sense of emptiness settled over Caleb. The farm fell into its familiar silence, but this time the silence was no longer lonely. It carried the echoes of conversation, laughter, and the hurried hooves of a fateful night. Caleb walked along the newly repaired fence, feeling the solidity of each plank he and Clara had hammered together. Every nail, every crack in the wood reminded him of her presence, of her strength and will. The farm was no longer a place to escape, but a promise. The promise of a new beginning, not just for him, but for Clara, waiting days. The days passed like molasses, each dawn bringing with it an agonizing sense of anticipation. Caleb spent his time fixing up the house, patching up rotten boards, reinforcing the roof. He worked tirelessly not only to keep the house from collapsing, but also to keep his mind off Clara's trial. Would she be safe? Would justice be served? Or would the Maddoxes, with their influence and ruthlessness, seek revenge? One night, as the moon hung high in a cloudless sky, Caleb sat by the fireplace where Clara had sat, the flames dancing on his face. He remembered her touch, her penetrating gaze, the faint scent of sage on her breath. He remembered her strength and vulnerability, the secrets she shared. He realized that although life had taught him to be alone, Clara's presence had awakened a part of him he thought had died, a desire to share, to fight, to protect. Sometimes he would hear the distant sound of hooves, and his heart would pound, a mixture of hope and fear. He would rush to the porch, but see only the dark shadows of wild animals, or the wind rustling through the trees. Worry gnawed at him, but he tried to push it away. He had done all he could. Now it was up to Clara, and the truth and the justice of the West. Dawn of truth. Finally, one early morning, as the first rays of sunlight touched the top of the hill, Caleb heard it. It wasn't the rapid, hurried sound of the horse's hooves that had come the night Wade Tucker had arrived. This time the hooves were steady, powerful, and he could feel a sense of relief in each step. He stepped out onto the porch, his gaze scanning the plain. 5 figures. Sheriff Ezra Bennett led the way, and beside him, Clara. She was back. Clara looked tired, but her eyes were unusually bright. When she dismounted, her steps were a little unsteady, but her face was filled with relief. Caleb walked quickly to her, not saying a word, just holding out his hand. Clara placed her hand in his, and the touch again was like a spark, warm and strong. "How is it?" Caleb asked, his voice hoarse with tension. Clara looked at him, a smile on her lips, the first time he'd seen her smile, for real, not a forced or bitter smile. "Justice has been served," she said, her voice full of emotion. "The Maddoxes will pay for what they did. My father, he will rest in peace." Tears welled in her eyes, but they were tears of relief, of a burden lifted. Ezra nodded, his face showing satisfaction. "Miss Clara testified bravely, Caleb. Her testimony revealed the whole truth." Caleb looked at Clara, his heart filled with an emotion he thought he would never feel again. Admiration, respect, and a feeling deeper than friendship. This girl who had come into his life like a storm had fought her demons and won a new beginning. That evening they sat by the fire again, but this time the fire was no longer a faint glow in the heavy darkness of the secret. It burned brightly, warmly illuminating the room and Caleb and Clara's faces. They didn't say much, just being together, sharing a comfortable silence. "Will you stay?" Caleb asked, his voice soft, breaking the silence. Clara looked into the fire, a soft smile on her lips. "This farm saved me once, and you gave me a reason to fight." She turned to look at him, her eyes sparkling in the firelight. "I will stay, Caleb, if you want me to stay." Caleb didn't hesitate. He reached out and took her hand, his fingers laced with her calloused ones. "I want to," he said, his voice certain in unspoken promise. They had no idea what the future held. The Wild West was always full of dangers and new challenges. But now they were no longer alone. They had found each other in an old house in the middle of a vast land, and in that connection, they had found a new beginning. The moon hung low over the prairies again, but this time it did not shine upon the ghosts of the past. It illuminated a house warmed by hope, a sturdy fence stretched out to the dawn, and two hearts that had found refuge in each other. Their story did not end here. It had only just begun under the wide western sky, where courage and redemption go hand in hand. It had been more than a year since Clara had returned, bringing a breath of justice and hope to the dusty farm. Now the 100 acres Caleb had bought for $1 had truly transformed. No longer a desolate shell of buried dreams, it had become a real home, a place of warmth and life. Caleb and Clara rebuilt piece by piece. They didn't just repair fences or patch up the roof. They built a sturdy new stable where strong, well-cared horses grazed peacefully. A small vegetable garden Clara had meticulously cultivated, rows of ripe tomatoes and lush corn, attesting to her perseverance and love. Clara's laughter replaced the lonely howl of the wind, filling the air with a warmth Caleb thought he would never find again. Though justice had been served for Clara's father and the Maddoxes had paid the price, their ghosts still lingered in the whispers of neighboring towns. Caleb knew that the West was never truly peaceful. There were always corrupt people, lost souls ready to cause trouble, but now he was no longer afraid. He had Clara by his side. One afternoon, as the sun began to set, painting the western sky red, Caleb and Clara sat on the porch, looking out over the farm. Caleb's arm wrapped around Clara's shoulders, feeling her softness and strength. Clara leaned her head against his shoulder, her eyes shining with contentment. "I never thought I'd have a place like this," Clara whispered, her voice soft as the wind. "A place I can call home, a place where I feel safe." Caleb squeezed her shoulder. "This is our place, Clara. Ours." Suddenly, the sound of distant hooves cut through the silence of the dusk. The sound was rapid, not like the sound of normal footfall. Caleb and Clara were instantly alert. The survival instincts of the West were too ingrained in their blood to ignore. Caleb stood, his eyes narrowing toward the horizon. 3 figures riding fast horses were approaching the ranch. Even though dusk had fallen, he could still make them out, strangers not wearing sheriff's badges nor ordinary herders. "New enemy, huh?" Clara stood up beside him, her voice surprisingly calm, though her hand had unconsciously tightened on Caleb's arm. Caleb nodded, his hand slowly moving to the pistol at his waist. He had sworn to protect this land, protect this home, and most importantly, protect Clara. The fight for justice for Clara may be over, but the fight to protect their new life never stopped in the Wild West. "Go inside, Clara," Caleb said, his voice low. "I'll deal with them." "No," Clara said firmly. "This is my home. I will stay here by your side." Her eyes met his. No fear, only determination. Caleb looked into them, and he knew he could not argue. She had proven her bravery time and time again. They stood there shoulder to shoulder, facing the approaching darkness. The farm, once a symbol of loneliness and suffering, was now a fortress of love and resilience. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. Because in this West, where life was always a struggle, they had found the most precious thing, family.